This, by the way, makes Peterson much more similar to the atheists that he's so critical of than to the traditionally religious Catholics or Protestants. Let's take a few examples. I mean, Peterson basically treats Holy Scripture as literature. In other words, it is not infallible to him. He admits that it contains highly problematic passages that are untenable today. He admits that you can't just focus on one specific Holy Scripture and rely that it is the best version, it is the only true version of some kind of divine truth, but you have to look at all classical literature. I mean, for Christ's sake, he's even interpreting Disney movies as classical literature. It's like, come on. He's really not focused on one specific tradition. Wherever he finds something that teaches us about human consciousness, he takes it up. Wherever he feels like something has become a classic and teaches us something about consciousness, he takes it up and quotes it. He's really not someone who's focused on a specific Holy Scripture. He's also insisting that whatever kind of truths you take out of these scriptures, you have to contextualize with the modern sciences. This is what he said explicitly to Sam Harris, but a few people mention it. He said that in order to separate the wheat from the chaff, the method he's applying, which is, by the way, very, very similar to what Wilber is doing. The method he's applying is he is cross-referencing specific statements which he finds in literature with the other disciplines that we have available today. So whenever he finds something popping up again and again in different disciplines, independently of each other, he thinks he has a reason to take it seriously and to assume that there might be something to it. So in the face of modern day psychology, which has taught us quite a bit about the unconscious and the distinctions that we have learned to make, like the distinction between first-person reality and third-person reality. With this in mind, there are specific interpretations of the Bible that are just not available to us anymore. In other words, they are just not fruitful. They cannot withstand the counterweight that is being created by the modern day sciences. And whenever an interpretation cannot withstand the modern sciences, he's actually dropping it. So the idea of the earth having been created in a few days of time, he of course rejects as absolutely absurd. Whatever kind of idea cannot withstand the modern day scientists, whatever kind of interpretation cannot withstand the modern day sciences, is being dropped. Only those interpretations that make it come into the next round, so to say, of seeing whether they can teach us something about human nature. And then again, we look at whether something comes up again in different disciplines, and if it does, then we retain it. Now the issue here is that there is no systematic way of finding out what is true and what is not, or which are real truths about consciousness and which are not, because we can't approach it as we approach third-person objects. This is why he gets so angry with Sam Harris when Sam is speaking about well-being, which is of course a subjective category. Peterson freaks out because he just can't make sense how Sam can be insisting that science can teach us about values, while at the same time introducing such a subjective concept. And then he says, well, you can't measure it. There is no way of testing it. Well, Sam never said anything about measuring it and testing it. Of course, Sam is willing to introduce the hermeneutic approaches to teach us about what actually counts as well-being. The only thing that we need to always retain is we have to be in the widest sense evidence-based. Whatever kind of conclusions we draw must be in the widest sense evidence-based and must be testable and be reproducible. This is something that we have also to apply. This validity criterion is something that we have also to apply to the left quadrants. This is, I think, what Sam is very likely to suggest. He is not going to suggest that there is any kind of mathematical precision-like method that could tell us what well-being will necessarily consist in. But he's saying that we can learn about well-being by just talking about it in reasonable ways. This is in ways in which we give reasons, and in ways where we experiment with different versions of being a self. This is sufficient, I think, to learn to distinguish. Once we get more experience as a species, what the states that we want to be in are and what the states that we don't want to be in are. So we're not doing here strict science, of course, we're not doing the natural science, but we're doing something that is much more on the lines of the narrative approaches. But where was I? Oh yeah, and Peterson, I think in general, takes a position which is much more similar to that of the atheists than to most traditionally religious people. And it is just because he has some kind of weird allergy towards the term atheism that he can't see that he actually shares much more with Matt Dillahunty than he does with the average religious person. He shares attitudes like, for example, the corrigibility of his statements. Of course, he admits that he can be corrected. He is not infallible in his interpretations about human consciousness. He shares the idea that we need to be skeptical. We have to test these statements again and again. That's something that most religious people, traditionally religious people, wouldn't allow. I mean, they're not constantly testing their statements that they take to be holy. And there are many other ways in which Peterson is much more similar to being an atheist. For example, what makes something bad, a bad action, is that it inflicts actual pain on someone else. This is that a actual existing subject of experience somewhere is being hurt. So that which makes an action bad, the bad thing about an action is that it is in some way destroying the integrity of a person. So the personhood in general defines what is good and what is bad, even for Peterson. On traditional religious interpretations, it is not the individual will, the individual person, the individual consciousness that defines the meaning of good and bad, but it is the will of God. So a traditionalist reading of ethics would insist that if it was right in the mind of God, something that actually inflicts damage on a person could still be a good act. In other words, you can be perfectly moral within a traditionally religious worldview. You can do whatever is required from God. You don't find any true moral dilemma where you're facing what have been called secondary values, and whatever kind of choice you make. By the way, the existentialists have been dealing with these real moral dilemma a lot. Whatever kind of choice you make, you always end up in a situation where some harm is being done. Therefore, some kind of drama has taken place, and it's never a state where you can feel absolutely free from guilt of not having lived up to someone's expectations. Traditionally religious people can be perfectly fine in committing absolute atrocities and feeling like they did the right thing, because they don't recognize persons as the legitimate authors of what is good and what is bad. The idea to recognize the person, to put the subject into the center and let it define what is good and what is bad, So when you want to know what is good, you actually want to know what is good for you. What is it that you want? This idea is an idea that was born in the Enlightenment. When people became aware of the first-person perspective as first-person perspective, roughly around Descartes, who was aware that the first-person perspective is different from the third-person perspective. And following that, once you recognize that the first-person perspective has its own mode of knowing, the idea of human rights popped up. The idea that when you treat someone as a subject, when you treat them as consciousness and recognize them as consciousness, when you recognize them as consciousness, you have to treat them differently. And you can't just treat them as mere means, as a mere object, just as you use other objects around you. In other words, as soon as you see that you're not only surrounded by objects, but you're also surrounded by experiencing subjects, the very idea of human rights pops up, because you see that subjects have interests, and recognizing their interests is making their interests a right, which is your interests, your rights become my duties. This is a modern day conception of ethics, and there is no further divine legitimation of ethics necessary. This is, by the way, what Sam Harris is arguing against when he's arguing against the naturalistic fallacy. I'll come to that in the next video. I think it's an important distinction to make. So I think Peterson would agree on this one. What makes something good, what makes an action good, is if the action is sustaining your integrity as a subject, as a person. If it's when it's making you grow, when it's making your world space grow, when it's making you foster, not foster, when it's making you develop and grow as a conscious creature, then that action is good. There is no further God necessary to make this action truly good. The only thing Peterson, I think, will have to criticize here is that we don't know what will make us truly fulfilled. We don't know what will make us develop and what the highest attainable human experiences are like, because we are largely unconscious to ourselves. This is, I think, the criticism that he will draw against this subjectivist account, which equates the good with what you want. But let me approach this in a different video.